Unity is another important principle of design. It is the oneness or wholeness in a design that occurs when all parts work together to create a cohesive whole. Unity, like balance, is very intuitive, and you'll have a sense of whether or not a piece is unified just by looking at it. Unity involves Gestalt methods. Gestalt theory contends that visual information is understood holistically before it is examined separately. Let's look at each of the methods. Grouping. We generally group visual units by location, orientation, shape, and color. Why do we see two distinct groups in example A? We see two distinct groups because they're generally different in value, so these are lighter in value, and they're in different locations. These two groups are just on different sides of the composition. Orientation creates unity in B. All of the pieces are oriented diagonally. And then in C, we mentally organize the groups by shape. Our minds are connecting all of the triangles, all of the squares, all of the circles together. Containment. The format itself actually creates unity because it contains all of the elements and it determines the positive and negative space. Repetition is an important part of creating unity. It occurs wherever we see the same element over and over again, and it tends to make the viewer feel those objects are meant to be there because you see them more than once. Proximity. That is the distance between visual elements. So unity and compositional energy increases with closer proximity. Continuity. Continuity creates a fluid connection among the compositional parts. And closure. That's the implication completed in the mind. For closure, you don't necessarily have to draw a line between two elements to connect them. Your eye will do that work for you. Each of these methods is described thoroughly in the textbook, and they're useful when you're thinking about how to unify your own work. But I would say that when you look at a piece of art, you will understand pretty quickly whether or not it's unified. Variety. Variety provides diversity and it counters unity. They're not mutually exclusive. A good piece will have variety and it will have unity. So to create variety, you are looking for different directional thrusts, different kinds of line, value, color, shape, and texture. So these are different elements and different organizations of those elements. This piece is one of my favorite examples of variety. It is a Sarah C. installation, and I've provided a video of her talking about her work in the learning module under the lecture item. Here's another piece by Sarah C. There are all different types of lines, different lighting elements. You might say, oh, this just looks really random. There's so many strange objects being juxtaposed with each other. But I argue that this piece is actually very well unified because there's a lot of repetition. So even though these sticks are very different from the oval-shaped lights in the background, there's enough repetition of the sticks in and of themselves, and there's enough repetition of these lights to make it all feel like it belongs. Look, there's actually more than one ladder. If there was just a random ladder sitting there by itself, you might think that it was left there accidentally, but because there's two, you know it's purposeful and that it's part of the composition. When we talk about composition, we cannot ignore Jacob Lawrence. This work here, Going Home, strikes a balance between unity and variety. The visual themes are repeated, so you see similar types of lines and similar types of shapes, but there are many different kinds of repeated shapes. If you were to isolate a small portion of this composition, you would see quite a bit of variety in terms of shape and detail, texture, value. But if you look at the whole thing, you see that each of those individual pieces is repeated often enough to unify the whole. Robert Rauschenberg's pieces are known for their sense of randomness and disorder, yet he still maintains a sense of unity in a piece that has as much variety as this sculpture here. The materials list is really long, so there's quite a bit of variety in texture and material. But what unifies this piece is the repetition of shapes. You see the circles in the wheels, referencing the circle in the bucket, and just the repetition of rectangles of all different dimensions and sizes in the door frame create unity. Let's move on to emphasis and subordination. Emphasis draws attention to an area. It can create a focal point in a work. You can use the word emphasis much like you would use it in everyday life. Subordination is the use of neutral areas of lesser interest that keep the viewer from being distracted from the focal point. In this composition, it's created by isolation and placement. So this little girl is one of a kind. Everyone else around her is an adult, and she's placed right in the middle of the composition. Contrast can be created in many ways, and here are a few examples. You can see that there can be contrast in the orientation of a shape, in the size of a shape, in its texture, or whether or not it is rectilinear or curvilinear. Let's look at a few paintings and see if you can identify what you think is the focal point before I circle it. In this case, the focal point is created by the contrast of this white-blue face against the black outfit. Where's the focal point here? You got it. This is created by complementary colors, creating contrast, also a little bit by placement because it's relatively central, and it's one of a kind, so by anomaly as well. The dramatic fire here is the focal point. Where's the focal point here? You got it. And of course, this last one, this is another Wayne Thiebaud. That's the focal point, of course. Let's look at directional forces or movement. These are paths for the viewer's eye to follow. They're provided by actual or implied lines. Directional forces can be implied by a form's axis or the connection between similar or adjacent forms or lines. There are plenty of directional forces going on in Francisco Goya's bullfight. You could look at the direction that the bullfighter and the bull are looking in. They're both pointing downwards. So there's definitely a directional force pointing in this direction and in that direction, and he appears to be looking at his own shadow there. There's also this connection here of their legs that are going in the same direction. So there's almost a triangle that's set up here. It's also good to notice the directional force of the gaze of the audience and the light source. So the light appears to be coming from the left, and the audience is looking on from the left. So there's a clear direction going from upper left down to the lower right. In Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, there are a couple directional forces. There's the one where you are imagining yourself actually walking around this restaurant at night, and you're following the curve of the building with your eyes. Your eye might also follow the movement of the barista, who is the only figure in the image that appears to be in motion. Eyes can create motion. This Lucian Freud painting is a great example of how the artist can direct your attention just by the location of the pupil, because we will tend to look in the direction that the figure is looking in. Harmony. Harmony is created in a composition through repetition, rhythm, and pattern. So these are all slightly different. So in repetition, some visual elements are repeated, providing stepping stones for your eye to follow. Your eye will jump from the similar items and connect them together. Rhythm is the orderly repetition of visual elements, or repetition in a marked pattern which creates a flowing movement or tempo. Pattern is a two-dimensional application of rhythm or repetition, such as the repeated motif in wallpaper or textile design. And here's a great example of all of the above: Gustav Klimt's Tree of Life. Donald Judd's Untitled aluminum piece is a great example of repetition. Here we have Popova's The Pianist, and this is a good example of rhythm, movement that is created through repetition. It has a structure of dominant and subordinate sequences. It's also clearly someone playing the piano, so there is that narrative rhythm as well. Let's look at some patterns. So pattern is a visual element that's systematically repeated over an extended area. Kehinde Wiley is really famous for his really intricate patterns and the portraits that he juxtaposes with those patterns. Go ahead and follow him on Instagram and you can see all of his work there. Let's talk about scale and proportion. Format refers to the size and shape of a two-dimensional picture plane. So the format of a computer paper is 8.5 by 11, or the format of a film might be the ratio 16:9. Scale is the size relation of one thing to another. Proportion is the size relationship of parts to a whole. Scale usually refers to the actual size of the piece in comparison to the human body. So this piece is pretty tall. It's about 17 feet high. I know it looks like it's taller than the museum, but that's just the way the photo was taken. This is Shuttlecocks by Clive Oldenburg. In comparison to the human body, it's actually quite large. It's made out of aluminum. On the other hand, and here we have actually a person with a tiny piece of artwork on their finger, showing you how small this piece is. In the museum context, you might completely overlook this piece because it's so small it can barely fit on a human finger. It is less than ½ inch across, and the material represents a lumber product from the Southern Hemisphere. The piece is a commentary on exports from countries in the Southern Hemisphere, and the reason why it's so small is because the artist wanted to make the point that news from South America is very much overlooked or easily overlooked by northern and western countries. So whereas scale refers to how large a piece is in comparison to you, the viewer, proportion speaks more to how large the different items are in the composition. So let's look at two pietas. Both of them are trying to deal with the problem of depicting Jesus Christ being held by Mary. And the issue here is, how does a grown man fit into the lap of his mother? And these two artists handled the problem in different ways. In this piece, you can see that Mary is actually much larger than Jesus. Her lap is sort of larger than life in order to accommodate his entire body. On the right, you see that instead of trying to make Mary much larger than the body she's carrying, instead this figure is emaciated in order for it to seem realistic that she could carry it. So it's just much thinner. So these are two different types of responses to the issue of proportion in the Pieta. While we did discuss contrast as it relates to creating emphasis, contrast is often referred to as its own principle of design. It is very much what it sounds like. You probably use this word in your everyday discussions. Contrast is the juxtaposition of strongly dissimilar elements, dark against light, large against small. This piece creates quite a bit of contrast between colors, between values, between patterns even. Here's our list again of the principles of design. Quiz yourself to see if you remember all of the different principles of design and how they're used.